The first original California form of rock and roll was in Southern California during the late 1950s and early 1960s. This was surf music, and it was based on a very proven model created by a group called the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys were led by their leader, Brian Wilson, and his two brothers, Carl and Dennis, along with other members Al Jardine and Mike Love. Surf music was a pop rock type of music based upon the musics of doo-wop, early rock and roll, as well as the pre-rock vocal ensembles, the Four Freshmen, the Four Lads, and the Pied Pipers. Brian Wilson was the musical engine behind the group The Beach Boys. He wrote most of the music, as well as providing the falsetto lead voice that became the signature for the Beach Boys music. Wilson also wrote music for other surf music groups in Southern California, such as the group Jan and Dean. Surf music itself was a vocal music dominated by unison singing or perhaps harmonized singing. The music also had a very smooth and continuous instrumental background. The Beach Boys had basically two developmental periods, one before 1966, one after 1966. The first period was primarily dominated by the topics that the bands sang about, primarily cars, girls, sun, beach, devotion. The car songs like Little Deuce Coupe, 409, and Little Old Lady from Pasadena were pivotal to the image of surf music, as was the music of the beach, the sun, the surf, which included tunes such as Warmth of the Sun. The devotion songs had to do with the good things in their particular institutions, such as the school. The tune Be True to Your School was one of the most popular of these tunes. After 1966, Brian Wilson quit having a direct effect upon the Beach Boys except to write their music. He quit the band as a performer and went into a collaboration with a Northern California lyricist by the name of Van Dyke Parks. From this time forward, Brian Wilson wrote much more progressive music, and while he did supply much of this music to the Beach Boys began progressing on their own. After 1966, they grew long hair, beards, started doing tunes with more controversial lyrics, critical lyrics, lyrics about the ecology, and tunes like Student Demonstration Time. This was a slow process that led to their Surf's Up album in 1971. During this second period, the Beach Boys were very conversant with the Beatles and vice versa. Both groups influenced each other's albums during this period. There were a few important groups that were active in Southern California during the 1960s and during the mid-1960s. One of those was the group The Doors with Jim Morrison. Another was the Byrds, a group that became a prototype folk rock group. And the third was the group Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. As we move up the coast to San Francisco, we have a climate that is very different from Los Angeles. The San Francisco climate is quite cold and damp. The people of San Francisco have been considered artistic, very cultured, and perhaps a little bit snobbish. While Southern California had very quick increases in population during the 20th century, San Francisco had pretty much reached its maximum population by the year 1900. The first music to represent the free speech movement in California during the 1960s was folk rock, or rather just folk music. This activity was centered around the University of California, Berkeley campus, which had become the bastion for liberalism in the United States. By the mid-decade, however, the music that began to represent the counterculture in this country was psychedelic, Northern California, San Francisco, or just plain acid rock. The term acid rock meant that this music was associated with LSD or acid. San Francisco rock became associated with very loud music and a deafening use of electronic amplification. It has had an influence on many other rock musicians and has led to the increased use of electronics in multiple banks of speakers. In fact, in the late 1960s, it was responsible for more than one complete electrical failure in theaters where these kinds of bands were booked. The function of acid rock was to provide a stimulus for the total experience of the people involved, musicians and audiences alike. It is not like a concert in which people sit in straight rows separate from the performers. The entire crowd and the band become a part of the musical and physical experience. The music was meant to be felt, not just heard. And anyone who ever attended a performance of acid rock knows that it can be felt. Amplifiers were turned up to the breaking point, and there is a great deal of created distortion. In fact, this is the first music in rock and roll where the massive use of amplification became apparent, and a music that became absolutely a model for later heavy metal music. Black Sabbath, as well as Kiss, point back to the Grateful Dead as their most direct influence. The primary influence for this music, acid rock, is music of the shouting tradition. But we will talk about 4 groups, and with each one of these groups there was a strong secondary influence from a different type of music. The subject matter for acid rock is normally anti-establishment and or drug-oriented. San Francisco rock was designed for a particular audience in a particular state of mind. It was not designed for mass consumption, which it rarely achieved. Acid rock was never really popular outside of San Francisco and New York. Another facet of acid rock was the high amount of improvisation used in the music. This was a collective improvisation with all of the members of the group improvising at the same time. Rock and roll typically is not an improvised music except for specific styles such as the blues, but acid rock used a collective improvisation that was very uncharacteristic of most other rock and roll styles. The groups that we will discuss briefly are Moby Grape, Jefferson Airplane, Big Brother and the Holding Company with Janis Joplin, as well as the Grateful Dead. Moby Grape was not around very long, only existing from around 1966 to 1968, but during its time it was a very influential acid rock group. The secondary influence for this group was music of the jazz tradition. There was a high amount of improvisation, and their greatest album, or considered their greatest album, Grape Jams, features guest performances by several important jazz rock musicians such as Al Kooper and Jim Fielder of Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Ultimately, Moby Grape seemed to be a fairly soft version of acid rock, but it had all of the elements of psychedelic. Jefferson Airplane was a very important and lasting group, based primarily upon the popularity of its very attractive and powerful lead singer, Grace Slick. The message of the Airplane was drugs, and many of the songs were strictly about drugs. The band used a psychedelic advertising package and was the first San Francisco group to be successful outside of San Francisco in New York. They had a potpourri of styles, blues, folk, jazz, rock, but in San Francisco-type crowds, they were very free in their performances. They made extensive use of light shows and were the first band to work out the light show so that it completely supported the music. The Airplane itself, of course, was analogous to the Beatles in Yellow Submarine. Its members were traveling in this very symbolic manner to bring their message to the world. The secondary influence for this band was probably folk rock. As you listen to Grace Slick singing, you can hear in her voice the definite influence from many of the folk singers before her. Jefferson Airplane was a slightly long-lasting group, slightly more long-lasting, of course, than Moby Grape. The group actually lasted into the 1980s, changing its name to Jefferson Starship during the 1970s. Big Brother and the Holding Company was a group of the late 60s, the peak of their popularity in 1968. The strength of this group was in its support of the tremendous talents of Janis Joplin. While Grace Slick perhaps was the first female white rock star, Janis Joplin quickly eclipsed her career. Joplin had been a blues singer prior to becoming a rock and roll singer and brought most of the tools of blues to rock and roll. Because of her gravelly, rather masculine, husky-sounding voice, plus all of the blues tricks, she became one of the best shouters among rock and roll singers ever. Joplin was definitely one of the most powerful women performers ever and became a model for other women in rock music. The Grateful Dead is the supreme acid band and the leaders of the cult. They were idealized in Tom Wolfe's novel called The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test as the group that traveled around and spread the message of LSD. The image was of a school bus psychedelically painted with a big sound system on top of the bus, blaring their music across America. They would be handing out LSD to anybody who would take it, and if they couldn't hand it out to them, they would pour it into water reservoirs. At least that's the image in the book. The statement was constantly made, you're either on the bus or you're off the bus. Jerry Garcia, their lead guitar player, was the molding force for the Grateful Dead. The Dead actually began as a country and blues band in around 1966. It was most popular between 1967 and 69. While many of the bands changed their styles, Grateful Dead, right up until the end of the group when Jerry Garcia died about 13, 14 years ago, was playing basically in the same style. This group was popular with the populace in San Francisco not because of their music so much as they were members of the culture that they supported. The members all lived in Haight-Ashbury and were members of communes, used drugs as massively as their audience did. They played for countless hippie parties, becoming the one band in rock and roll that played the most free concerts ever. This endeared them to their audience, which followed them right up until the end of the band in the 1990s. Of course, their audience is known as the Deadheads. Their music is psychedelic, but quite often in a very relaxed way. Although they may have seemed shocking at the time, there were other bands that took what they did much further. Of course, Black Sabbath and Kiss, heavy metal bands, point back to Grateful Dead as their main influence. The secondary influence for the Grateful Dead, country music, is best expressed through the second group that the Grateful Dead created in the late 60s, the group that became their opening act, a group called the New Riders of the Purple Sage, through which members of the Grateful Dead would move in and out of for several years. Jerry Garcia himself enjoyed playing pedal steel guitar. I'd also like to make a brief mention of the last stylistic era during this period, garage rock. While garage rock has been around for a very long time and still continues to exist, it's not so much of an era as it is a way of playing rock and roll. Garage rock bands are usually dominated by one or two musicians who are the visionary musicians in the band. These are musicians and bands that are not interested in playing cover music from other bands and trying to earn a professional place by playing dance music in nightclubs. The mission of garage bands is to develop their own original music. The problem is most garage bands feature musicians who are not highly formally trained either on their instruments or their vocals, and they usually take a very long time to develop the music that they're trying to do, the original music that they want to send to the recording companies. They spend this time in their garages or their basement rehearsing the bands, sometimes for weeks, months, and sometimes years. Quite often, garage bands would develop a demo of one or two tunes that they would send to a recording company. More often than not, the music would get thrown out by the company, but occasionally one of those tunes might actually get pressed and released by the recording company. And then very occasionally one of them might very well become a hit song. Typically, garage bands were what we call one-hit artists. If they did indeed have a hit song, quite often there was not enough talent or ability in the band to continue their career after that one hit. Garage bands are quite often influenced by the music around them in their particular region at the time that they're creating their music. A couple of bands that we feature on our discography, one is The Choir from Cleveland from around 1966, 1967. The other is a group called The Music Machine from Los Angeles from about the same period. The music of The Choir was very much influenced by the music in Cleveland or in the Midwest at that time, which was primarily Beatles-oriented music. On the other hand, the music from The Music Machine was very much influenced by the music that was most popular on the coasts at the time, which were the Rolling Stones.